So, having grown up in the Bay Area, I fondly remember those Jewish National Fund boxes that we would use to collect donations to plant trees for Israel. Years later, when I visited Israel for the first time, I saw the fruits of that effort and the Israeli ingenuity that has truly made a desert bloom.
Girl Scout cookies are so passé. It's been almost 100 days since Joe Biden and Kamala Harris took office, and we said goodbye to Donald Trump. For now. And while there's still a little time before we can judge with some finality the Biden administration's first 100 days, I gotta say, it's great that instead of getting a $15 minimum wage and $2,000 COVID relief checks, we got bombing the Iranians in Syria. While the administration is still young, we can already see which direction certain policies are going, like foreign policy, especially with regards to occupied Palestine and Israel. Hey guys, I'm Sana. I'm not looking forward to a Republican president in 2024, and in this episode, we're going to talk about how and why President Joe Biden and his administration might be worse for occupied Palestine than the Trump administration. There is no doubt that the Trump administration was absolutely abysmal for Palestinians. Not that American policy for the Palestinians has ever been anything short of abysmal. It's always relied on, as Professor Noor Erekat put it in a recent op-ed, the same bottom line, the foreclosure of meaningful Palestinian futures. The same long-standing bottom line that also makes clear that the American position on Israel is non-negotiable, rendering Palestinian and Israeli life and aspirations unequal. But there is something to be said about the Trump administration's audacity and pacing, and it was devastating for Palestinians. The administration gave Israel strategic, economic, and diplomatic gains without any asks in return, without any concessions.
Mr. President, your deal of the century is the opportunity of the century. And rest assured, Israel will not miss this opportunity.
So that included making moves like the Abraham Accords, led by Victorian doll child Jared Kushner, which normalized relations between Israel and several Arab-majority countries, supporting the annexation of the Syrian territory of the Golan Heights, moving the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. It included former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo saying in late 2020 that the State Department would implement a plan and process to declare NGOs like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch anti-Semitic. Yeah, and they almost got away with it too. The Trump administration's heightened assault on Palestinians also included eliminating aid to UNRWA, a UN organization dedicated to relief and aid for Palestinian refugees. And of course, we can't forget the continued and further blessing of settlement expansion and increased home demolitions in the West Bank.
The Trump administration is reversing the Obama administration's approach towards Israeli settlements. The establishment of Israeli civilian settlements in the West Bank is not, per se, inconsistent with international law.
Trump was good for Israel. 63% of Israelis certainly thought so. While many commentators and political analysts have characterized the Trump administration's record on occupied Palestine and Israel as a departure from the Obama administration, especially on the question of settlements and engagement with Benjamin Netanyahu, it actually was also a continuation of the Clinton administration's approach. And by that, I simply mean, again, giving Israel all the gains at the expense of the Palestinians and not getting any concessions in return, much like we saw in the Oslo Accords. But Sana, Biden's back, baby. He's gonna bring us back to the path of Obama. First of all, not tempting. Secondly, not tempting at all. There's often an overstatement about how good President Obama and his administration, which of course included Joe Biden, actually were on Palestine. It was, after all, on that administration's watch that we saw one of the bloodiest assaults on Gaza, Operation Protective Edge, which claimed over 2,000 Palestinian lives and was defended by the Obama administration under the guise of Israel's right to defend itself. And it was the same administration that signed an agreement in 2016 giving Israel $38 billion in aid over the following decade, the biggest military aid package in U.S. history. And those settlements that Obama thought didn't exactly, quote, advance the cause of peace, they expanded significantly during his tenure. So the Obama administration wasn't bad for Israel. It was actually pretty great for it. And you don't have to take my word for it. Listen to what then Deputy Secretary of State Antony Blinken had to say about Obama's record on Israel at the American Jewish Congress in 2015.
No administration and no president has done as much for Israel's security as President Obama. Don't just take my word for it. Listen to another voice who called this administration's support for Israel's security, and I quote, unprecedented. And that is the voice of Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu.
Blinken is now Biden's Secretary of State. In the less than 100 days that the Biden administration has been in power, it has shown little interest in moving the needle in any other direction than the one set by its predecessor. In fact, it's shown every indication so far that it will uphold Trump's actions. In doing so, the Biden administration will possibly be worse for Palestinians and for the solidarity movement in the United States because it will bring right-wing, anti-Palestinian, anti-free speech rhetoric, policies, and practices under a liberal veneer. What was perceived as radical under Trump will be normalized under the Biden administration, worsening the prospect for Palestinian liberation and protection of life.
I believe that when any organization delegitimizes Israel, we must stand up and speak out for Israel to be treated equally. And that is why the first resolution I co-sponsored as a United States Senator was to combat anti-Israel bias at the United Nations and reaffirm that the United States seeks a just, secure, and sustainable two-state solution.
In 2017, then a new senator, Vice President Kamala Harris uttered these words to a room of policymakers at the AIPAC conference. Yeah, the very right-wing Zionist AIPAC. Her first act as senator from the state of California was to co-sponsor a resolution condemning the Obama administration's abstention from a UN vote denouncing Israel's settlement expansion in the West Bank. To date, Harris has spoken 3 times at AIPAC and has not received endorsements from the liberal Zionist organization J Street, with which many Democrats find themselves aligned. Given the central and bigger role she's believed to take on in the White House, especially in the run-up for the 2024 election, there are critics and supporters who believe that Harris will push Biden's foreign policy on occupied Palestine in particular to the right. Why? Because despite Biden's own history via the Obama administration, he's not considered an ideologue on Israel in the way that Harris has shown herself to be. And while Biden recently reinstated aid to Palestinians and recommitted to the two-state solution, a long dead and buried prospect, those actions are simply a return to the status quo, and there is much to suggest that the administration will move to the right, certainly compared to its Democratic predecessors. Biden hasn't shown any interest or commitment to moving the embassy from Jerusalem or withdrawing the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, 2 Trump moves that broke with decades of bipartisan U.S. policy and with overwhelming international consensus. He's shown no interest in placing real substantive pressure on Israel. In her confirmation hearing, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, reiterated her support not just for Israel, but also against UN resolutions that hold Israel accountable.
I look forward to standing with Israel, standing against the unfair targeting of Israel, the relentless resolutions that are proposed against Israel unfairly. Israel has no closer friend than the United States.
She also called BDS a movement that, quote, verges on anti-Semitic, and said she would encourage other countries to follow suit of the Abraham Accords and normalize relations with Israel. These are all moves which hurt Palestinians and uphold the foreign policy successes of the Trump administration. And while the Biden campaign made it clear in its platform for Arab Americans that it would defend the constitutional right to free speech, it also reiterated in the same breath that Biden condemns the BDS movement. The same BDS movement that has long been under attack by state and federal lawmakers who've attempted to criminalize it. But Biden's position on protecting the right to support BDS is also undercut by his upholding of another major move by the Trump administration, adopting the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism, a definition which conflates criticizing the state of Israel with anti-Semitism. Even the guy Kenneth Stern, who drafted that working definition, said that it was being weaponized to suppress free speech. He pointed to the disparity in adopting that definition of anti-Semitism and how we don't even have a legal definition for anti-Black racism in the United States. Nope. And the Biden administration, through the State Department, has also expressed concerns about the International Criminal Court's recent decision to probe into alleged war crimes committed by Israel against Palestinians. The State Department actually said in a statement that because occupied Palestine isn't a sovereign state, it can't be party to any ICC investigation. Everyone knows that war crimes can only be committed against real states, not an entire population that is occupied, ethnically cleansed, kept in an open-air prison, and subjected to a system of apartheid in an attempt to deny them any semblance of sovereignty. Of course not. Also worth noting that the Biden administration has not yet withdrawn sanctions against ICC officials that had been imposed by the Trump administration for investigating alleged American war crimes in Afghanistan. Biden isn't a departure from long-standing American policy on occupied Palestine and Israel. He's a continuation of it. And while Trump was as Trump as he was, especially on occupied Palestine, on Israel, he too wasn't a departure, just a quickened, brasher version of it. He said the quiet part out loud. What's at stake now, as it's always been, is the liberation and future of Palestinians, a liberation and future tied inextricably to us through our tax dollars, our elected officials, our foreign policy. And Biden, like his predecessors, is showing us already how little care there is for the protection of Palestinian life in this country. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. So I'm going to be taking a couple of months to work on something new for AJ+, which means you need to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so that you remember to come back when I come back. We'll see you soon.